I'll see you soon.
Tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons from the Patreon page. That's Cecilia Spears, Hawaii, Carl Leakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, Iron Alexa, Allison Seib, Ryan Woodward, Bree, and Bonanza Jellybean. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel through Patreon. And if anybody listening right now enjoys the content of the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel and would like to help keep it going and growing for a long time to come, then click the link in the description below and sign up on Patreon for as low as $2 to $5 per month. You get some great rewards depending on the tier you select and early access exclusive content before it reaches YouTube. Appreciate you all. Enjoy tonight's upload of Final Destination. Final Destination, Dead Reckoning. Chapter 7. Jess sat back on the bench, narrowing her eyes at the sheriff. She was starting to associate him with bad things. She watched as he pulled out a sheaf of paperwork and leafed through it, his face grim. He turned to Jess. "Congratulations, you made bail." "I did?" Jess turned to Charlie. "How?" In reply, the sheriff wordlessly tossed her the morning paper. Jess looked at it blankly, then unfolded it with a gasp. Pictures of the club were plastered all over the front page. Someone had obviously been working through the night to get this edition out in time. She looked up at the sheriff and tapped the page, licking her dry lips. She had to know. "Do they know what caused it?" she asked nervously. The sheriff's lined face crumpled even further. "We have our suspicions." He nodded to the end cell. "One of them's sitting over there." Jess turned to see a young female police officer sitting on the bench in the cell. She was sitting so still that Jess hadn't even noticed her before now. She was staring straight ahead, out of the window, wearing a sorrowful expression. She immediately recognized her as the officer from the club. "Her? What did she do?" "What didn't she do?" The sheriff pulled out another sheet of paper and squinted at it. "Says a lot of curious stuff here. Incorrect police procedure, discharging a firearm without due care, failure to obtain correct search warrants before breaking and entering." "What's that got to do with anything?" asked Jess. "Could be everything, could be nothing. We don't know yet. Preliminary reports suggest that the collapse of this warehouse into the club was caused by a fire under the floor." "And how is that her fault?" "That's just it." The sheriff ran a hand along his mustache, narrowing his eyes at the officer. "Somebody called the station in the middle of the night to report hearing a gunshot. We checked out the remains of the building and found a bullet hole in the back door of the remains of the floor, matching the specs of a Colt .45 round exactly. Officer Hewlett here is field-equipped with the Colt .45. She was picked up in the vicinity of the club following its collapse. Upon questioning, she admitted to discharging her weapon illegally to gain entry to the club via the back door. The fire is thought to have started in the same area." "Why didn't she just come in round the front like everybody else?" "Officer Hewlett was under the impression that she is special and that police work should be like it is in the movies." The sheriff held up his hand to silence the officer, who started to protest. "However, that is not the case, and now she has now come to understand that." The sheriff's expression hardened. "The disaster site is currently under forensic investigation to establish the exact cause of the fire. But in the meantime, I'll hazard a guess that young Marina here could be looking at some very, very steep penalties indeed." In her cell over by the window, Officer Hewlett hung her head. Jess felt an enormous weight lift off her shoulders. She knew that she should feel bad for the police officer, but for the moment, all she felt was relief. Relief that the blame had been removed from her. "So, I can go home now?" "Bail has been granted, yes," said the sheriff. "We've been unable to contact your parents, so this young man has kindly offered to pay the $2,000 bail and take both of you home." Jess blinked. She was going home with Charlie. He thought that she was worth $2,000. "However," the sheriff went on, "you are still guilty of a number of lesser offenses, for which you shall stand trial at a later date. I'm going to recommend community service." He picked up his hat. "However, for now we have work to do, and I gotta get going." He gave Jess an old-fashioned look. "You do remember where the door is, don't you?" It was later, and Jess was warm again. "Are you sure you're all right in there?" "Yeah, I'm fine," Jess called out, sliding down further in the bath and reaching for the soap. It was incredible how the simplest of things, soap and hot water, could seem so wonderfully luxurious. She worked the soap into a rich lather on her arms and ducked them under the water, washing off the grime of the night. A rubber duck floated nearby, bobbing up and down in the foamy water and giving her a look of plastic amusement. "Okay, then. I'll be out in the garage if you need anything." "Thanks." The world turns, then turns again, thought Jess, settling back into the water and glancing around her appreciatively. A few short hours ago she had been on the run from the police, wanted for suspected manslaughter. Now she was at Charlie Delgado's house taking a bath. She thought about that for a moment. She was in his actual house, in his actual bathtub. The same bathtub that he was naked in on a regular basis. Jess did her very best not to squeak. Charlie had such a cool bathroom, she thought, looking around through half-closed eyes. It was tastefully decorated with white-tiled walls and chrome fittings that wouldn't have looked out of place in a five-star hotel. There was a predominance of marble in the decor, a hair-dryer hanging from a hook by the bath, and an abundance of fluffy white towels hanging from heated towel rails. Jess knew that they were heated because she'd backed into one while she was getting undressed. Her shriek had brought Charlie and half the household running to the door. He'd laughed and told her that it happened a lot. Jess winced as she remembered the bathrooms of the guys she normally hung out with. The last time she'd been around Jamie's house for rehearsals, she'd felt compelled to run out to the supermarket, even at 10 to midnight, to buy toilet cleaner. Disinfectant wipes, a laundry basket, a screwdriver to fix the broken lock, and most importantly, toilet paper. Why did guys never have toilet paper in their bathrooms? Jess scratched her head and shrugged to herself. It was one of the eternal mysteries of guyhood. It was as though there was some kind of unwritten agreement between all men aged 18 to 30, specifying that if they wanted to use each other's bathrooms, they should bring their own toilet paper. And more importantly, that they should never, under any circumstances, tell any woman about this agreement. This would ensure that any woman visiting would be forced to buy them toilet paper, which they'd then remove from the bathroom and squirrel away under lock and key, so saving them from ever having to buy any themselves. Jess shook her head, casting her eye over the artistically arranged cactus plants on Charlie's windowsill. This guy not only had toilet paper, but he had pot plants, and colorful little bottles of conditioner, and a shower curtain that wasn't even semi-pornographic. That fact alone meant that she was probably going to have to marry him. The water lapped around her ears, and Jess closed her eyes and slid under the water for a moment, holding her breath in the clanging depths as she washed the shampoo out of her hair. Suds billowed out around her, turning the water cloudy. Emerging, Jess squeezed herself out a second handful of fruit-scented shampoo and reapplied it, massaging it vigorously into her scalp. She couldn't believe how good it felt to be clean again. It was as though she was washing away the events of the last 24 hours away, emerging clean and new with the fresh chance of life. Lying back, she closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the water surround her, soothing her tired muscles and soaking the grime off her skin. The water felt so good. Slowly she began to drift off to sleep. A breeze blew in through the open bathroom window. Above her, the hair-dryer started to swing on its hook. Outside, Charlie slung his bag of tools over his shoulder and clanked up the steps toward his garage. He needed to do something while that chick took a bath, or he'd start thinking about last night again. Eric had fled home, leaving him alone with his thoughts, which were not something that Charlie wanted to face right now. Clicking open on his remote control, he watched while the garage doors hummed smoothly open. And there she was, the love of his life. Tossing his keys onto the back bench, Charlie gazed adoringly at the sleek black car inside, finding himself growing misty-eyed with pride. At 21, not only was he lucky enough to have his own bachelor apartment in the prestigious Westwood, paid for by his doting father, but he'd also recently acquired a mint-condition 1970 Chevy Camaro. He'd even got a bar job and paid for some of it, although in the back of his head he'd realized that the part he'd paid for with his entire summer's labors had probably been one of the hubcaps. This car sure was a beaut. It was midnight black with leather bucket seats and chromed white-walled wheels. Ever since he had taken ownership of it 3 weeks ago, it had been all Charlie had thought about. It occupied his thoughts like a beautiful woman, and called to him just as often. Whenever he had a spare moment, he found his feet automatically carrying him down to the garage, just to sit and look at it, to make sure that it was real. He felt like if he didn't, it would evaporate like so much gold dust, leaving him with nothing but an empty parking spot. He was so proud of that car. He'd spent a week reorganizing the garage so that everything was away from the car, so it couldn't get scratched. He'd recently installed shelves along all 4 sides of the garage, stacking them high with all the boxes of junk that seemed to accumulate in the corners of the garage. Anything sharp or potentially scratchy, shears, gardening tools, and so forth, had gone up in big wooden boxes on those shelves. He'd wanted a Chevy ever since he was a little boy, and now he finally had one. He was damn well making sure that nothing could possibly happen to damage it. However, as with all vintage cars, it was seriously high maintenance. Charlie had quickly grown used to coming down here with his bag of tools, tuning this and tightening that, just to make sure his baby was kept in tip-top condition. He enjoyed it more than anything else he could think of. Well, almost anything else he could think of. Right now he was adjusting the fan belt, which seemed to be slipping. Tomorrow's job was oiling the handbrake, which had taken to sticking from time to time. It wasn't too serious. It was one of those vaguely annoying things that could wait a day or two while he attended to more important things. Charlie smiled. Funny old car. He loved its little quirks. Dumping his tools down on the work surface, Charlie popped the hood. Ducking his head inside, he began work, pausing every so often to mop his brow. It was coming up to 5 in the afternoon, and the temperature was still well into the 80s. Man, was it hot. Charlie straightened up, wiping his forehead on a sleeve. Working with one arm in a sling was seriously cramping his style. His arm was feeling a lot better today, but it still ached like hell where the muscle was bruised. Damn fire truck. He still couldn't feel one of his fingers. The doctor had assured him that feeling would return very soon when the bruising went down. But for now, it was just another little annoying thing he had to deal with. After a minute or so of work, Charlie turned and pulled a large bottle of ice water out of the nearby cooler. It was just too hot, but he didn't want to stop working. Pulling the cap off the bottle, he took a deep draught. As he regarded the car, mopping his forehead with a polishing rag as he gazed down at the car lovingly. She really was a beauty. Perhaps he'd take that chick for a spin in her later. What was her name again? Tess something? Charlie swished the water around his mouth reflectively, then swallowed and opened the passenger door, tossing his jacket inside. Yeah, he'd take the girl for a drive. It was a nice evening for it, and it would take his mind off the unpleasant events of last night. He'd cruise up the Pacific Coast Highway, maybe stop off at the Malibu Inn for a cocktail and a romantic sunset on the beach. It could be a very entertaining evening. Charlie gave a half smile. She was an odd one, that Tess, but she was kind of pretty, in a scruffy kind of way. He remembered what Eric had told him about her escapades last night, and was now curious to find out more about her. Apparently, she had like a vision of what was going to happen. That was seriously strange. Charlie wondered vaguely whether or not she'd sleep with him. "Hello, Charlie!" Charlie rolled his eyes and tossed the rag up onto a shelf. Amber. He watched her come up the garden path, staggering slightly in her hot pink miniskirt and high heels. Her handbag was pink, as was the dangling cord of the headphones she constantly wore. Charlie sighed. The girl had a great figure, true, but in spite of that, he was starting to get a little tired of her, if the truth be told. He remembered how she'd clung to him like a frightened puppy all the way home from the police station last night, refusing to leave his side until he told her to go home and get some rest. He had to actually order her a taxi to get her to leave so he could get a little shut-eye. She kept blubbering about the fact that her friend Heather was dead, and he couldn't sleep with her crying in his ear all night. It was understandable that she should be so upset about Heather, he supposed, but it was just a little strange considering the fact that the two of them usually couldn't stand one another. Funny thing that, he thought. He knew that he was the most popular guy in class, and he also knew that Amber and Heather had long vied with one another for his affections. Each one knew that the other one wanted him like crazy, but rather than admit that they hated each other, they had instead pretended to be the very best of friends just so that if one of them was invited out by him, the other could come along too without feeling the slightest trace of guilt. That was the trouble with girls, Charlie thought. They kept their friends close and their enemies even closer. It could make for some really interesting nights. But Charlie didn't mind their little games. In fact, he actively encouraged them. It suited him down to the ground to have two girls rather than just one as a date. And he had the added perk of knowing that they'd do just about anything to outdo one another and claim Charlie's heart as their prize. Well, Charlie reflected wryly. It wasn't his heart that they each regularly claimed, but as far as he was concerned, any other part of his body was just as good. In fact, he'd invited both of them out with him to the club last night, intending to leave with whichever one of them put out first. But his plans had been seriously scuppered by the roof falling in on their heads. Charlie took a moment to reflect on that. Jesus, that was one close call. If that Tess girl hadn't stopped the show when she did, he supposed that they would all be dead right now. That would seriously suck. And worse, if he died, he wouldn't be able to drive this beautiful car anymore. He shuddered at that thought. Amber reached the top of the path and ducked her head around the edge of the garage. "Knock, knock! Charlie! Oh, there you are! I don't know if you were in or not." "Hey, girl." Charlie worked up what he hoped was a genuine-looking smile. He was doing car stuff right now. He didn't particularly want to be disturbed. He hoped that Amber wasn't staying long. He picked up a wrench and swung it idly. "What's up, kiddo?" "Nothing much. I just thought I'd swing by to check on how you were doing." "I'm doing fine, Pumpkin," said Charlie, shrugging. He was doing fine. Working on his car was his way of dealing with things, of taking all the stressful shit out of his mind and turning it into a fixed carburetor or a newly oiled bearing. The way he saw things, shit happened, and you could choose to either deal with it and move on, or drag it out feeling sorry for yourself until everyone around you got sick of you. Charlie put down the wrench as Amber slipped around the side of his car. He saw her metal belt buckle make contact with the paintwork as she slid around towards him, and suppressed a grimace of genuine pain. Some people just didn't think. Despite this, he hugged her, then kissed her passionately as she pressed herself up against him. She held on to him for a long time. When she pulled away, he saw to his dismay that her cheeks were wet with tears. "I just can't believe she's dead," whispered Amber. Her body started to shake. "Oh, Christ, here we go again," thought Charlie, as he stroked her hair in what he hoped was a comforting fashion. This was going to take time. More specifically, his time. Didn't she have any girlfriends available to work this stuff out with? Out loud, he said, "I know. I can't believe it either. It seems like just yesterday that Heather was here with us." "It was yesterday that she was here," wailed Amber. "It's just so unfair." Sniffing, she reached up and dabbed primly at her eyes, being careful not to smudge her mascara. Then she stepped away from Charlie, reaching into her purse for a tissue. As she did so, she knocked over an open carton of engine oil that was sitting beside the car. Dark brown oil gushed out, running beneath the wheels of the Corvette and pooling on the garage floor. "Oh, I'm sorry." Amber bent down to try to pick it up. "Here, let me." Charlie bent down and rescued the carton. Most of it had spilled, running away in a thin, oily line down under the car and out through the door. He shook the carton, then peered in. It was nearly empty. That was just great. "Not to worry," he lied. "There wasn't much left anyway. I'll stop by at the gas station and get some more." "You going out later?" Amber's tears immediately stopped, and she perked up, looking hopeful. She hooked her fingers into Charlie's belt and pulled him towards her. "Can I come? Where are you going?" "Nowhere, sweetie." Charlie carefully unhooked her fingers, trying not to let his irritation show. "I didn't have any plans to go out." "But your jacket's in the car," Amber pointed. Charlie looked. His jacket was indeed in the car. "So?" "So you always put your jacket in the car if you're going out later, silly. You forget it otherwise, and then you get cold when the sun goes down." She fluttered her eyelashes at him. Charlie shrugged, irritation rising within him like steam. What was with Amber today? She was never normally this observant. Turning, he cupped her face in his hands, trying to inject some warmth into his voice. "I'm sorry, sugar. I just don't feel like going out this evening. I'm kind of tired, after last night and everything. But hey, thanks for dropping round." Pecking her on the cheek, he turned away and picked up his wrench. "Perhaps we can stay in together then." Amber stepped up behind Charlie as he began working and pressed a suggestive kiss on his neck. She smelt like coffee and lip gloss. "I could go to the store, get a bottle of wine, maybe some strawberries." "I'd love to, Cupcake, but let's do it some other time." "I'm really just not in the mood, babe." Charlie shrugged, idly picturing Jess up in his bathtub. She'd been in there for hours. Perhaps she was waiting for him to join her? He should go up there as soon as he'd finished fixing the car. It could be really worth his while. "Why not?" "What?" "Why don't you want to hang out tonight?" "I do." Charlie was still thinking about Jess naked. He blinked, trying to focus through the swirling images of his internal porno show. I'm just not in the mood right now, He thought for a minute, then brightened. "Can you drop by tomorrow?" "What if I don't feel like dropping by tomorrow?" Amber looked away from Charlie. Her bottom lip began to quiver. "Come on, Amber, baby, don't be like that." Charlie reached out for her, but she pulled away from him angrily. "Heather's dead. Do you even care?" "Don't be silly. Of course I care." "Then why don't you want to be with me?" Amber blew her nose loudly. "We should be going through this together." "But we are, honey." Unfortunately, Charlie added to himself. He pulled out a tissue and smiled winningly. "Look, I'll spend all tomorrow with you. How's that? We'll go to the pier. Go on that big old wheel she likes so much. Maybe throw some rose petals off the top for her into the sea. Heather loved her roses, remember? And then we can... What? What? Why are you looking at me like that?" "Heather hated roses. She said they smelt like her grandmother's mothballs. I'm the one that loves roses." Amber's face crumpled. "I like the pink ones, not that you'd ever remembered." She began to cry. "That's what I meant, babe. Do you even care about me?" "Of course I do. Look, Heather, sweetheart." "My name is Amber! And don't you dare sweetheart me, Charlie Delgado. Not now, not ever. My friends were right. You're just a big loser. And you're mean, and you don't love me. You never did love me. You don't even care if I live or die." Spinning on her heel, Amber turned and flounced off down the pathway. "Amber!" Charlie called after her. Amber's only reply was to raise a perfectly manicured middle finger in his direction. "Oh, to hell with it." Charlie turned back to his Chevy. He stroked a hand soothingly along its chromed wing mirror. "You still love me, baby, don't you?" With a put-upon sigh, he opened the door of the car and leaned across the passenger seat, reaching for his jacket. He supposed he should go after her. After all, when all was said and done, she was still a good lay, and she'd stuck around a lot longer than most girls did, almost 2 months at the last count. Hell, that practically made her his girlfriend. He tugged on his jacket, but it seemed to be stuck on something. Charlie saw that the sleeve was caught in the door on the passenger side. Feeling too lazy to walk all the way around the car to free it, Charlie put a knee on the driver's seat and crawled through the car, awkwardly balancing on his bad arm while he opened the far door to free his jacket. Mission accomplished. He pulled the door shut and crawled back through the car. Suddenly his wrist buckled and slipped between the seats, sending a stab of pain shooting up his arm. Charlie swore and toppled sideways. Instinctively, he jammed his other hand down to support his weight, and quickly jerked his injured limb out from between the seats. As he did so, the full weight of his body came to rest against the ancient handbrake. With a quiet click, it disengaged. The car began rolling forwards. Charlie's head whipped up like a prairie dog as he felt the car begin to move. "Fuck!" Scrambling backwards as fast as he could, Charlie clambered back into the driver's seat. Grabbing the handbrake, he tried to pull it back, but now, of all times, it chose to stick. Usually he solved this problem by pumping the foot brake a couple of times until it released with a loud clunk. This time the car didn't seem to want to respond. After a couple of attempts, the foot brake locked up too, along with the steering wheel. Cursing freely, Charlie grabbed the handbrake and pulled on it with all of his might. The brake moved upwards by half an inch before jamming completely. Try as he might, he could not budge it. Fuck, fuck, fuck! Daylight filled the car as it slowly rolled forwards out of the garage, heading towards the driveway that ran steeply downwards towards the busy street. Between the driveway and the road, a concrete wall loomed. If the car got onto the 45-degree slope, it would smack into the wall in about 3 seconds. Charlie couldn't let that happen. He'd spent a fortune importing that chrome headlight and bumper set. His daddy's insurance people would never forgive him. A crazy idea shot through his head. Leaping out of the driver's side, he grabbed hold of the Chevy's doorpost with one hand. With the other, he seized the garage door frame. He wasn't letting the car get out of that door. He braced himself. Oh, this was gonna hurt. In the warmth of the bath, Jess dreamed. It was a strange dream filled with shouting voices, broken thoughts, and confusion. Out of the hubbub, Jess found herself walking down a narrow pathway, hewn from bare rock, surrounded on both sides by a deep chasm of darkness. The crazy voices died away as she walked, and soon she was surrounded by nothing but golden silence. She peered downwards, and immediately her head swam with vertigo. The chasm was so deep that the bottom faded into nothingness, as though she were walking above a black, shimmering void. A faint hint of blue was visible at the very bottom, so far down that it might have been a trick of the eyes. Jess thought it was very beautiful. She looked on ahead up the path. At the other side, there was the dark shape of a majestic mountain range. The scale of the mountains was beyond belief, soaring way up into the night sky, and towering over the path like ancient stone gods. The mountains appeared to be made out of a translucent kind of crystal, lit from within by a benevolent glow. Tiny twinkling lights were dotted about all over them, as though they were covered in habitations of some kind. Jess knew instinctively that she would be safe there. She glanced behind her. All she could see was darkness. Steeling herself, she started walking up the long path towards the mountains, trying not to look down. After a little while, she became aware that the path in front of her was getting narrower. Soon it had tapered down to little more than a foot across. Jess paused, looked down, and shivered. She was so high up. She looked across to the other side and saw that the path behind her was evaporating like so much smoke, blowing up into the air. She couldn't go back, only forward. She craned her neck, looking far above her, and saw that the smoke was billowing and twisting over her head, forming a complicated double helix shape before looping over and joining up with the path far in front of her, where it became solid ground. Jess stopped, uneasiness creeping over her like a blanket of marching spiders. A breeze kicked up, blowing leaves and newspaper over her head. A double-page spread wrapped itself around her midsection, blown by the wind. Jess reached down and pulled it away from herself. Holding it up to the light between her thumb and finger, she saw that the club disaster had made front-page news, even down here in this strange place, wherever she was. There was a picture of the smoking ruins, a long list of the names of the victims, and bizarrely, a photograph of herself underneath, stark naked and holding a platter of cheese. How weird, thought Jess. She turned the newspaper over in her hands. On the back was nothing but an advert for engine oil. She dropped the newspaper page, and the wind whipped it away from her, spinning off into the void. Then she stopped. Up ahead of her, a figure formed out of the mist and began walking toward her. Jess screwed up her eyes against the light, trying to make out the figure's face. She knew in her gut that it was someone important. As it approached, Jess saw that it was her mother. "Mom, over here!" Jess yelled, excitement filling her like helium. She hadn't seen her mom in ages. She started to run toward the figure. Then she slowed and stopped. Then she broke into a run again. Then for a second time, she stopped. She frowned. The figure of her mother was still walking steadily toward her, but every time Jess took a step forwards, the path before her seemed to lengthen, carrying her mother further away. Jess looked down at her feet. Beneath her, the path was less than 8 inches wide. Jess stood very still. She couldn't risk falling. She would wait here for her mom to come to her. As her mother approached, Jess saw that something was wrong. Her mom was dressed all in black, and her face was shrouded by a thin veil. And she was crying. "Mom, what's the matter?" Jess's voice sounded like it was stretched thin, coming from a great distance away. She cleared her throat and tried again, but her voice came out the same. She waited for her mom to reply, but she did not. Instead, she pulled a lacy handkerchief from her pocket, daintily blew her nose, and then carried on walking. She stopped opposite Jess and seemed to pause, her worried green eyes meeting Jess's behind her veil. Jess swallowed a lump in her throat. There was so much history in those eyes. Her mom had never cared much for her, acting as though motherhood had been dumped on her, like some crappy waitressing job that she couldn't wait to quit. Sure, she went through the motions, but Jess knew that secretly she couldn't wait for her and her sisters to hit 20 so she could turn them out of the house and get on with the life of partying, drinking, and drugs she left behind. Everyone in the family knew that it was true. But now her mother seemed different, uncertain. Jess saw her mouth twitch, as though she was trying to work out what to say to her. It was as though she finally understood what it was to be a mother, faced with the thought of losing Jess. She must have heard about the club disaster on the news. As Jess watched, a tear slowly slid its way down her cheek, and her mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Scarcely daring to breathe, Jess reached out to hug her mother, to brush her tears away, and tell her that it was all right. She understood. She still loved her. Her hands went straight through her. Jess was left holding an empty air while her mother continued on her way, walking down the path away from her, weeping and wailing. Jess froze, feeling a dagger of ice work its way into her heart. "Mom?" she said. Her voice raised weird echoes from the landscape. "Mom!" There was no reply. She turned around to see that the dark figure of her mother was several hundred yards from her now, already vanishing into the mist. Again she yelled, "Mom!" She began running after her mother, but the faster she ran, the quicker her mother moved away. Soon she had disappeared into the darkness of the night. Jess slowed and stopped, staring after her mom. She had completely vanished. Panic set in. The night seemed to be pressing in around her like thick, black molasses, working its way into her skin and filling her bloodstream with darkness. Jess strove to breathe, panic gripping her heart and squeezing her ribcage. She knew that she had to carry on across the chasm, but she didn't want to leave her mother behind. She couldn't. She knew instinctively that if she did, she would never see her again. Jess began running back down the path as fast and as hard as she could. She didn't dare look down. After a few minutes she stopped, panting for breath. Something caught her eye, and Jess looked downwards. Something had fallen out of her mother's pocket when she'd taken out her handkerchief. Jess stooped down and picked it up. It was a pink rose. It was pretty. Jess sniffed at it, but it had no scent. She tucked it behind her ear. As she did, one of the thorns snagged her hand with a sharp pain. Jess winced and sucked at her hand as blood started to flow. She looked at her finger. 3 drops of blood fell from it, splashing onto the path beneath her. Damn Rose! Jess sucked on her finger and stared in anguish into the darkness. She couldn't go back now. It was too dangerous. She knew somehow that her mother was lost forever. Turning around, she began walking and tripped over something lying on the path. She looked down. It was a body. More specifically, it was Charlie's body. Jess looked down at him. He was still dressed in his smart combats and white arm sling, but his head was missing. The bloody stump at the top of his neck glistened wetly, soaking his crisp white shirt with red. A fountain of blood poured from him, gushing towards her down the path, spilling over the sides and raining down into the abyss. Jess screamed. Outside in the garage, the car was proving to be much heavier than Charlie had originally thought. His grip tightened as the car rolled forward another few inches, then slowed. He swore loudly as he took the strain, the full weight of the car stretching his bruised muscles to their limits. He gave a gasp of pain, his arms quivering with the tension. But his grip held, and slowly the car drifted to a halt. Charlie breathed a sigh of relief. Now all he had to do was secure it with something. Then he could get the key from the bench at the back of the garage and reverse back up the slope. Idiot! He couldn't believe that he'd nearly dented his beautiful car. His eyes narrowed as he did a couple of quick calculations. If he let go of the car again, he'd have about 10 seconds to grab some rope and secure the car before it hit the slope. That was more than enough time to loop the rope around the metal doorpost of the garage. That would hold it, no problem. Grunting, he reached out with one foot towards the dangling loops of blue nylon tow rope that was hanging from the shelf just behind the garage door. He couldn't quite reach it. Charlie thought for a moment, running through the various options currently open to him. Then he sighed and hollered, "Amber!" There was no reply. If Amber was there, she was ignoring him. He tried again. "Amber, get up here!" No response. Shit! Charlie's bad arm began to shake with the effort of holding on. He cast around frantically for a backup plan, but his brain seemed to have frozen at the thought of his beloved car getting the least bit damaged. Even one scratch would be too much. He looked back at the rope, hanging tantalizingly just inches out of reach. There was nothing else for it. He'd have to make a grab for that rope. Steeling himself, Charlie let go of the car. It immediately started drifting forwards. Charlie lunged towards the dangling rope and yanked down on it. Half the reel flopped down towards him. The other half stayed resolutely on the shelf. It must be caught on something, Charlie thought frantically. He tugged on it as hard as he could, but it didn't even budge. There was a sliding, grating sound from above him. Charlie looked up. His eyes widened. Oh, shit. He flung himself aside as a big box of tools tipped over up on the shelf. Power tools and gardening implements came sliding down towards him, pouring off the shelf like rain. Charlie yelped in pain as a pair of garden shears bounced off his shoulder, then hurriedly ducked as the entire box came crashing down, missing him by mere inches and clattering down all around him. And then all was still. A spare hubcap revolved slowly on the garage floor, in accordance with the ancient rules governing such a situation, then came to rest. The coil of rope stayed resolutely on the shelf, snarled on a jutting nail just behind where the box had been. The car! Charlie thought desperately. Clutching the end of the rope, he ran towards the Chevy and looped it through the circular tow bar beneath the rear bumper, just as it rolled past him out of the garage door. He pulled the rope tight, looping the free end tightly around the doorpost and praying that the shelf would hold. In less than a second, the rope sprang taut. Charlie braced himself and held tightly onto the loose end, taking the strain like a one-ended tug-of-war contest. The car stopped rolling. Charlie breathed a sigh of relief, cocking an eyebrow at the bizarre cat's cradle of rope he'd created. He couldn't believe what a mess he'd got himself into in such a short space of time. But the car was safe, which was the main thing, right? Now all he had to do was tie up the free end of the rope, and that was that. He bowed his head to an imaginary cheering crowd. He was so clever. Anyone else would have just accepted their fate and let the car roll, but not him. No, sir. He'd save the car and save the day. Fate could go hang. There was a creaking sound from behind him. What now? Charlie thought irritably. He didn't dare look over his shoulder to locate the source of the sound, concentrating on holding on to the rope. His shoulder felt uncomfortably warm, and it took him a moment to notice that he was bleeding. Oh, great. He craned his head around trying to see the injury. The shears had grazed his shoulder, slitting open his expensive Armani sweater and gashing his skin. Blood welled slowly from the shallow wound. There was another creak, louder this time, behind him. Then the shelf behind him slowly began to pull away from the wall. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the driveway, Amber sat down on the wall and sniffed to herself. She heard Charlie call out to her and pouted. There was no way in heaven or hell that she was going back to him. He'd called her Heather, that bitch. She knew that he loved her the most, so what was he doing even thinking about that little slut? It just wasn't fair. What was with Charlie today? Last night he'd been so nice to her, kissing her forehead and holding her protectively as she cried. She felt so good wrapped up in his strong arms, safe and warm and protected from the horrors of the night. He'd been incredibly sweet, and had even gone to the trouble of ordering her a taxi so she wouldn't have to walk the 3 blocks home from his home. It was almost as if they were actually dating. But today something had changed in him. He'd shut himself off to her again, as though yesterday had never happened. He did that sometimes. It was as though there was a switch inside him that clicked on and off at random. When the switch was on, he was the most loving, caring person ever. But when it was off... Amber wiped her eyes on the back of her hand, noting with a sob that her makeup had streaked. She'd spent hours in the bathroom getting ready so that she could just drop by on Charlie. She'd taken a long shower using 5 different kinds of hair product to get her hair just so. Then spent a good hour wrestling with rollers and pins, blow-drying her long blonde hair into big bouncy waves. Then she'd painted her nails a pretty shade of pink, done her makeup impeccably, tried on 12 different outfits before settling on the one she was originally wearing, chosen matching shoes, and finally spritzed herself all over with sparkly perfume dust before heading out towards Charlie's house. She'd known from long experience that 5 in the afternoon was an optimum time to drop in on him at the weekends, just after he woke up from his afternoon nap and before he headed out to football practice. More often than not, he'd invite her along with him, and she'd spend a blissful afternoon watching him play, watching from the sidelines and pointedly ignoring the other 6 blondes on the bench who were also cheering him on. He was hers. Didn't they see that? The fact that he hugged them all when he came to sit with her at halftime did nothing to dampen Amber's enthusiasm. She knew he appreciated all the effort she went to in order to attend the games, and that deep down he loved her for it. He never said it out loud, of course, but she could just tell by the way he looked at her. Really, she could. But today it had all been for nothing. Charlie didn't want to see her tonight. He hadn't even noticed what she was wearing or how prettily she'd done her makeup. She sniffled again, wiping her eyes as her mascara started to run. That boy was a waste of perfectly good eyeliner. As she reached for a tissue, a trickle of gravel rolled down the steep driveway behind her. Up in the garage, Charlie stepped towards the light, pulling up his sleeve so that he could see the wound on his shoulder better. He winced. That had better not leave a scar. The creaking behind him began again. Charlie glanced behind him. Damn it! What was that? Several things happened all at once. The first thing that happened was that Charlie's foot slipped on a patch of the motor oil Amber had spilled. He stumbled and started to fall. As he did so, the shelf gave up its brief struggle with the laws of friction and came away from the wall, unable to take the strain of the entire car pulling on it. It flew, spinning across the room, whistling at high speed through the space Charlie's head had been occupying just a split second before he slipped on the oil. The next thing that happened was that Charlie hit the ground. A second later, the coiled end of the rope whizzed towards his head, looped like a lasso. "Charlie!" Charlie's head whipped around at the sound of his name. It had come from the house, and it sounded like Tessa's voice. It was followed a second later by a loud splash, a bang, then a scream. Then all was silent. An instant later, the coiled rope landed in the exact spot his head had been a moment before Tessa's yell. It shot onwards over the concrete and disappeared out through the garage door, dragged off behind the car. Charlie watched as his beloved Chevy rolled away from him and vanished down the steep driveway. He let out a small sob. At the bottom of the driveway, Amber came to a decision. She'd had enough. She would get herself a proper boyfriend, one who was just hers, who actually got her name right 2 times out of 3, and didn't spend all his time chasing after cheerleaders. She took a deep breath, intrigued by this new thought. Yes, that's what she'd do. Charlie could go screw himself as far as she cared. Her friends had been right. She could do so much better than him. Amber ran her fingers thoughtfully through the long grass in the flower bed behind her. She touched the pretty flowers planted amongst the grass, and bent over to inhale their scent. They were miniature roses. Amber picked herself a pink one, breathing in its perfume while she came up with the plan. She would go home, pick up her keys, and then drive into school to see if that cute quarterback was still out on the field. She knew that he had a crush on her since 3rd grade, but she'd never even given him a chance while Charlie was around. Hell, Amber thought wryly, nobody got a chance when Charlie was around. She would ask him out and go from there. It would be the start of a whole new life for her. Standing up with a flourish, Amber brushed off her skirt and popped her earphones into her ears. Clicking on her MP3 player, she scrolled through until she found her current favorite song, Aerosmith's Angel. She cranked it up loud, then started walking across the driveway, heading home. Above her, a midnight black Chevy rolled silently out of the garage and began speeding down the slope towards her. Jess saw the car heading down towards Amber, and her fingers tightened on the bathroom window ledge. "Amber, look out!" she yelled as loudly as she could. Behind her, the hairdryer fizzed and bubbled in the tub. Jess was so glad that her dream had woken her up when it did. 5 more seconds and she would have been toast. But for now, she had more important things to deal with. She yelled out of the window again. She saw Amber stop and half turn towards the house, her brow creasing with puzzlement as she strove to hear over the blare of her MP3 player. Then her face dissolved into a look of panic as she saw the driverless Chevy heading towards her. She clutched her purse to her and started to run. Jess's hands flew to her mouth as she saw the girl's foot slip on the thin trickle of motor oil running down the driveway from the garage, forming a small but deadly puddle at the bottom of the slope. Next thing she knew, Amber had come crashing down on her back, winding herself. The car picked up speed as it shot towards her. Amber tried to roll to one side, but she was not quick enough. There was nothing Jess could do but watch in horror as the car carried on over on the top of Amber, rocking slightly to the side as it rolled over her. A spray of blood spattered out from beneath it, mingling with the motor oil on the driveway. Then the car was still, its front half sticking out onto the road, its downward plunge halted by the human wheel jam. An arm stuck out from under the side of the car, still holding a pink rose. Jess felt the world swim in front of her eyes as she stared at the second body that she'd seen in 24 hours. She backed away from the window and then slowly sat down on the edge of the bath, staring at a point beyond the floor. Outside she heard running footsteps, then the sound of yelling. In her head, an unavoidable countdown had begun. The 8 survivors were down to 6. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 7 of Final Destination Dead Reckoning. Hope you guys are enjoying this book so far. I thought tonight was a pretty intense chapter, but I did make a couple mental notes I wanted to go over with you guys real quick. Some disappointments I had with the writing. Number one, I thought the sheriff, his personality and character traits just kind of changed mid-paragraph, really. Like, he was kind of a jerk to her for the most part, but then all of a sudden, he's like feeding her all of this information about the arrest on that other policewoman, you know. I mean, I get it, he might feel bad that they arrested the wrong person, but he gave her a lot of information that I just don't think would have been given to somebody in a real situation like that. But that's just my thought. Maybe I'm wrong there. The other thing is, if Charlie knew so little about Jess, like he thought her name was Tess, I mean, why did he bail her out and stuff? You know, just did he really spend $2,000 just to get laid? I mean, the guy's a piece of shit, but so maybe that's what it was. Who knows? The other thing was, I had to actually stop recording for a minute towards the end of this and make sure I didn't skip a page, because the whole thing about her being in the dream, and then the next time we see her, we find out that the hairdryer had fallen into the tub right after she'd woke up and got out of the tub. I'm like, I had to go back and be like, did I miss something? You know, because I thought I missed a page or something where that happened, but no, I didn't. That was how it was written. You just find out that when she, apparently off screen or off page somewhere, while this stuff was going on with Charlie and Amber, she had woke up from her dream, got out of the tub, and the hairdryer had fallen in. But I thought that would have made a really cool, you know, little scene there, but it wasn't in the book. Just the mention of what had happened was in the book. So the way I read it is the way it's written. But to me, it feels like that's something that should have been written in the book. You know, that should have been like a little something that I should have been narrating. You know, it just seems like it would have fit the story better. But anyways, guys, other than that, I thought the premonition again, what she saw in her dream, you know, like hints at the rose, the oil, and, you know, Charlie being decapitated and all that. I thought that was really cool, very well written, very descriptive, really put you in the moment there. I thought it was really creepy. I thought it was really cool how she stopped Charlie from dying, and how everything was so close. You know, like the way it was written about how the rope went right where his head was and everything. So we know how he should have died in that moment. And also, guys, read a part of the book that makes all these Final Destination books so much fun. They finally figured out death is after them. I have a feeling things are going to get pretty intense from here on out. So, I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I know I am. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of the book so far, what you thought of tonight's chapter. And I'll be back very soon with more of Final Destination Dead Reckoning. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
I'll see you soon.